Brooklyn.
All right, on today's episode, we're going to go ahead and use the NBA playoffs as a backdrop for a discussion around what the Brooklyn Nets have tried to do over the last 3 years, whether or not it is a failing method of winning a championship, and how much responsibility Kevin Durant holds going forward as Brooklyn tries to reclamate their championship road. And that's all coming up right after the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn. Yo.
All right, welcome into the Locked On Nets podcast on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the off-season Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I am Adam Marber, covering the New York Football Giants over on the One Giant podcast. He's Doug Norrie, owner-operator, DFSR, for all your daily fantasy sports rankings. DraftKings, FanDuel, he's got you covered. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day, free on all those great platforms. Doug, let's just take a minute here. NBA playoffs are in swing. We have a good conversation coming up here to contextualize, I think, what's going on in Brooklyn. And I have some heavy-hitting questions really to ask you. This is inundative reporting that I'm about to do to you here. But how are we? How are we, sir?
Still doesn't feel great to say off season.
Sure.
I think I'm still getting used to that part of it, where watching hoops every night, obviously, but not being able to watch the Nets feels a little weird. So then when we come to sit down, because there's a part of me, I will say, there's a part of me that at least a section of my brain is still in in-season mode here, even though with the dawning realization sometimes when we go to record that oh yeah, there's not going to be any more post games coming, but
right.
My brain hasn't totally let go of the in-season thing. I can just tell by the way I'm thinking about it, because sometimes I'll think about the podcast we think about the podcast a ton, but I'll think about it we'll think about what we're going to talk about and what are the storylines and what we want to hit in a given day. And there's been so many days for months and months and months where those, every third day at worst was a game. Right. We knew it. And those are always the score.
What were the stats?
Those are the most fun to talk about. And those are win or lose. Those are still always the most fun to talk about.
Yeah.
And then, so that is, or they're a different thing to talk about. And so I've definitely am finding it to be, I haven't dropped off the cliff in terms of where I've been thinking about the season. So the fun thing about NBA, I will say the one thing, and this is what's going to fuel this conversation, is almost as much fun as the games is speculating on what teams do. It really is. This is what drives full long year-round discussion around the NBA. Most sports, NBA I think does the best at it, is that there's just so many different discussions around the piece moving with each team and what teams can do. And so yeah, the offseason ends up becoming it's as fun, it's just totally different.
Oh, yeah. And I think, we talked about before, just the speculative nature of it is I can give you 9,000 versions of this, where in season, it's the result is the result. The game's ahead or the game's ahead.
Oh, Adam could do 365 straight days of trade. You could do 365 straight days of Trade Machine podcasts. We could do, if it was up to Adam, I mean, this is a little hyperbole, but not totally. We could just do one trade a day from now until next year at this time. And that would be, I feel like that would satiate you in some way, right?
The only way that we know that's 100% true is that Andy over on the Giants podcast would say the exact same thing about me in mock drafts. I can't stop. I won't stop. I'm always I'm running the cycle. I'm going, no. Guess what, guys? At 147, chef's kiss. No one's going to see this guy coming. So it's 100% true.
Day one, how did the Nets get Jared Vanderbilt? Day two, how did the Nets get Donovan Mitchell? Day three, sure. How did the Nets land TJ Warren? We'll get through it. We might actually run out of players. All right, we're getting far afield.
That being the case, we're going to get into Kevin Durant's comments in the post game and just kind of how those contrast against Kyrie Irving, and really what role does Kevin Durant play in this decision-making process around Kyrie Irving. Has the player option for a little bit north of $36 million, as we said yesterday, $246 million max contract on the line. But as we saw the first two teams to get bounced here were the Brooklyn Nets and then the gentleman's sweep Atlanta Hawks at the hands of the Miami Heat. I did want to ask you about Trae Young, who is a superstar talent, is obviously a guy that's ascended in the league. When you see him in a series against a team that I also want to compare to who the Nets took on in the Boston Celtics, the Miami Heat, when he only has 22 made field goals and 30 turnovers across 5 games, does that reframe how you assess Kevin Durant's performance over the sweep against Boston? Like, can you take the step back and go, hey, I see a guy that I'm not going to turn around and say maybe the wheels are falling off of Trae Young, but maybe it's just possible to run into a bad matchup with a team that knows how they want to approach defending and playing you. And I guess maybe, 4 or 5 bad games in a row is actually possible, even for the best players in the league.
Yeah, look, and to be clear, Adam is not comparing Trae Young to Kevin Durant. I think
And I
like
am
we
not.
would all, and this was just a conversation we had off air, but like it's more of the context around like a superstar driven teams compared to when there's not enough, like maybe you don't have enough firepower. I think there is something to be said because it actually works out a little bit the same in that I think Boston is a much better version of Miami. Like, and the Nets they're not versions of themselves, but like the Nets are also better than Atlanta, right? So, and so it works out sort of as a comparative line because where this, and I'll get back to Trae in 1 second, like where the Celtics differ is that like they actually have a superstar, like that is
Yes.
Tatum. Tatum is a legit top, maybe 5, no worse than 10, 100 for sure. Not going to go through the list here. Player in the NBA at this point. The Heat do not have anyone like that, though Butler, can be in the conversation. So I think the comparison around these lines is good because Atlanta has Trae. They don't really have anyone else that would rate out as a second superstar at all. But when you run into a balanced, well-run team, like even though you might have the best player, and that's probably up for debate in the series, and let's just for the sake of this call Trae that
Right.
it's closer. But when you don't have that, when you have that guy, but like the rest of the parts don't really fit or can't get you over the hump, then we kind of see what happens here, right? Where one team can or this way, the one team like Miami can totally neutralize your best player, then it can become so problematic for some teams, right? And like, look, Miami beat Atlanta without Jimmy Butler and without Kyle Lowry.
It didn't take the full force of the Miami Heat to accomplish that.
Yeah, like Victor Oladipo and Tyler Hero and Gabe Vincent beat the Hawks essentially in a closeout game. So I do think there's clearly something to be said for a team that has, I hate to use this word, but like a clear culture around it and a clear game plan around how they're going to play stylistically, how they're going to run the whole team top to bottom, where it does become a little the way their salaries are structured, it does become a little easier to withstand, some of your best players not being around and to kind of just hone in on what other teams' best things are and take it fully away. And from those ways, I do see the series between Miami and Boston Nets and Hawks as comps for each other for sure.
Well, that's what's interesting too, because again, this is all driving towards the decision around Kyrie Irving in this offseason. And I think when you look at Miami and then you look at Boston and we say, these are balanced teams. Now, whether or not ones have more stars than the other superstar talents, that's fine. But they're balanced teams. They're really well-coached teams, top to bottom. The organization, Miami underneath Pat Riley, you go, that works because this is a guy that can dictate terms even to the highest profile of players. Eric Spoelstra has been in control there. Even when you expand it out around the Eastern Conference right now, whatever happens, Toronto is overachieving, right? You and I thought, boy, why did we think about taking the Toronto Raptors against the 76ers? And now, even if they lose, it still ends up looking like, yeah, but look at what they're able to accomplish based on all the same cornerstones across those 3 teams I mentioned. It's about having a balanced, even depth roster, having guys you can rely on coming off the bench with consistency, and then running a system, having a structure in place. And by contrast, Atlanta doesn't necessarily fall into this. You only have to go back a year prior when they really started flipping things over and trying to bring in different pieces around Trae Young to get some success for him. We know what Brooklyn has obviously been up to, and then we know what Philadelphia was involved in, obviously, over the last couple of years and their trust the process approach. Like, it does this start to eat away at this premise of superstars obviously are always going to drive the league, but this thing where it's like, hey man, get 2 or 3 of them, pile them together and let the veteran minimums fly? Because it seems like whether or not the ultimate goal of winning a championship is further away from those even keel teams, they certainly are able to compete and remain competitive more frequently than not.
Yeah, and look, the counter to that is, well, I'll give you the counter to that in 1 second, because I think there's a lengthier counter, which is then going to dovetail into this Kyrie Irving conversation, right? Because there's a lengthy counter to that piece of it, and then we can start talking about where we land on what the Nets should do this offseason with Kyrie Irving, assuming that they have a choice around it, right? So so there's there's a couple of pieces, moving parts here, but I do want to get to all of that stuff for sure. First, we're going to talk to you about our friends over at betonline.net. Betonline.net had some kind of interesting odds this week where they started throwing out the odds around one of Mr. Kyrie Irving if he were not to sign with the Nets. And they kind of labeled some of the teams where they could go. The Mavs were in. There's a lot of teams in there. I'll tell you what. You want to get fans heated up? Have fans. BetOnline, great job with this, because start talking about their team signing Kyrie Irving in the offseason. I'm only speaking about the fan response. Most of them did not like the odds that they were seeing. I will tell you that. Those are our friends over at betonline.net, your number one source for all betting stats and sports info. You go over there for sports developments, league reviews, news, crazy odds like with the Kyrie Irving thing, and more. BetOnline's your continued source for all of your sports wagering information, from live betting playoffs through the esports. I got NHL, MLB, NBA. It's all rolling right now on BetOnline. Head on over to betonline.net. You can learn about all of the trends in action. BetOnline, where the game starts.
Okay, so that initial opening is to set the table for responsibility, right? Is Trae Young responsible for being better in that series against Miami and trying to pull them along to victories? Is Kevin Durant responsible to do more in the series against Boston, win or lose overall, but show up with a higher level of consistency? And now we're met with this question around Kyrie Irving and what the Brooklyn Nets should do here. You said you wanted to add a little bit more context to the counterpoint of building a balanced, organization and roster, because just to say, one more thing is, when you have that balanced, even keeled roster, you tend to stay out of these waters where you have these really seismic big decisions to make on an offseason to offseason basis.
Yeah. So the quick counter to that is the Nets actually did build this balanced roster, but like they just got a lot of them got hurt or they traded them away. So there's a world where Ben Simmons just plays and is healthy. Joe Harris doesn't need, reconstructive surgery on his ankle, right? Kevin Durant plays the whole season. There's no vaccine mandate, and the team is Harden doesn't get traded, and the team is just more balanced. Like it's not like they didn't have the players. Some of this was an availability thing for whatever reason. So I think it's a little unfair to call the Nets unbalanced. I think that a lot of it made total sense. It just never could get on the court at the same time. Now, you can make the case, maybe you just keep choosing all the wrong guys. Like that could be it. Like it can look great. It can all look great on paper. Maybe you just keep signing the wrong dudes that just can't stay on the court consistently or injury prone or whatever it is in their best iteration, or in the optimal iteration that I think was the vision. They had all the firepower and frankly, maybe even depth that they needed. They just couldn't keep all these guys on the court for whatever reason at the same time. So that's the quick counter to the depth piece, because the depth, but like I said, you could also just keep choosing the wrong dudes, right? Like some players, not all players around their availability are built equally, which we have seen. So if you just keep grabbing on guys that don't always want to be on the court as much as everybody else, like that can be a problem too. And which by the way leads us into this Kyrie Irving thing.
Exactly. And by the way, when you are top heavy, when you have a couple of superstars, the roster around them tend to be a little bit thinner or not as talented necessarily. Yes. So if one of those players is to miss time, you don't have the balance like we talk about with some of these other organizations. That being the case, though, we know that Kyrie Irving has the player option for $36 million this offseason. It's obviously fully expected that he's going to decline that because he can get the $246 million 5-year max offer from the Brooklyn Nets. I teased this question last episode and we kind of shoot it aside a little bit. But when we talk about Kevin Durant's responsibility, we know that Kyrie Irving, he signed first, but he's there because it got Kevin Durant there. And now Kyrie Irving can get paid because Kevin Durant is there. But is it unreasonable for Sean Marks to go to Kevin Durant and say, listen, I get that you want him here. I'm even going to reframe it differently this time. I get that you want him here. But what we want to do is go to Kyrie and say, you know what? You want to be here long-term? Opt into the $36.6 million player option. Good faith, show us that you will show up and be a part of this team for an important championship run this upcoming season, and we will go ahead and give you the big money thereafter. If for whatever reason Kyrie were to say, what are you, nuts? Like, no, I'm not doing it. Okay, to your point about those bet online odds, fan bases at least, I don't know about how teams would feel. He is not exactly an attractive option right now. So where would he walk to? Declining the player option, entering free agency. I'm sure some team would want to come to the table for him, but are they going to come to the table nearly at the same amount that Brooklyn might be willing to commit to him? Like, I wonder if at some point you have to draw this line in the sand, or I shouldn't even be on the fence. I think the Brooklyn Nets should really be considering drawing some type of line in the sand around, hey, we need to know that you're actually on board with this, as opposed to hearing the way you speak about things in the media or on social media, whatever the case may be. There's too big of a sample size of not being able to rely on you going forward. And if we commit $246 million and you don't show up, that's it for us. We're done. We might as well move on from Kevin Durant at that point. And I do have the follow-up around that piece.
Okay, so they're not okay. First of all, they're under no circumstances, short of him asking out, would they ever move on for Kevin Durant. So I and I don't think he's going to do that, at least not right now. Although with these superstars, anything can happen. I don't think we're at that place with Durant. No. And we're also at a place with Durant too, where I love Durant. I mean, if you're looking at where his head is at, he spent like all day arguing with people on Twitter. If you were following along his Twitter feed today, it was pretty hilarious. He came people, and I'll say this. Don't be the person that tweets at the athletes and just like calls them names. Like, it just doesn't do anything. Right. Like, it's just, if you find yourself doing that, just hit stop, delete it. Like, keep a little voice of Adam and Doug in your head and say, don't be the person that tweets at Kevin Durant. You're not going to troll the multi-millionaire, like, who can do most things better than you. Like, and that's not even me like standing for him. It just doesn't make sense for you to do it with anybody. Okay. Right. So that being said, the Nets are in such a tricky spot here, because on the one hand, it's been made pretty clear that Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving are boys. And if you're just going to want to keep Kevin Durant around and happy, it seems like he wants to play with Kyrie. And at some point, like, that is maybe the whole story. Where you are really and this is, I'll say right now, this offseason here is one of the most crucial. This is going to define the Nets for a long time. No matter what happens here, this offseason will define the Nets for a long time, because the almost all paths are fraught with peril on what you do with Kyrie Irving. If you have this conversation, this hypothetical conversation you mentioned with Kevin Durant, and it doesn't go well, then you risk what he wants to do over the short term. And he would have a total out, because he would say, it's not me asking out. The organization didn't follow up on the things that I thought they were going to. Sure. Right. Like, and we've seen superstars ask out of contracts or ask to be traded for a variety of reasons. And sometimes you just need to give them the powder to like be able to light the powder keg, right? Or you need the match to light the powder keg. And so you can have that you can even trial balloon that and see, and it can go poorly because maybe even asking the question is poor. So I think that's problem number one. And if all things stem from that, then you shouldn't do it. Then you have to sign Kyrie Irving to keep Kevin Durant. But then at that point, you are committing maybe to, like what we said yesterday, like a 4 or 5 year contract at max money. And we've seen too, one of the other biggest ways to submarine your organization is pay max money to just the wrong guy. Right. Because like, these are the contracts that become totally untenable, totally untradeable. It's, they can't move it. They might already have one of these on the books with Ben Simmons. And if you had two, like, because of Kyrie issues, you kind of can ruin your whole organization. There's no other way to put it. This is why I mean, it's so tenuous around what to even do here, because I don't think any of the options are particularly that attractive, but they're not attractive for different reasons, right? Like, yeah, Kyrie Irving as a basketball player is an attractive, option for sure. But we have other evidence that Kyrie Irving has other non-basketball related things that affect his availability, and then therefore can affect his trade value if it were to go wrong. And now you're really up a creek. Does that make sense? I know that's kind of winding, but
and the thing is too, no, to your point, like, so it's like signing him. So you're keeping Kevin Durant happy, and we're going to get into what we think around his responsibility in this circumstance and everything that's happened to this point, even for the franchise. But if you re-up him, here's the problem for me, and why I bring this up. It's because if you re-up Kyrie Irving and it doesn't go well, then it's going to be a circumstance. You know what? I have a little bit of this is going to go deeper than I wanted it to be. So let me go ahead and get us out of here for a second. We'll come back in and we're going to explain why re-signing Kyrie Irving then creates a new layer of potential issues, and basically saying you've sown your soul to this process and you're not going to be able to get out from underneath it anytime soon. Before we do that, though, it's very fun times on the podcast. Got to tell you about our friends over at Rock Auto. You know that we've been talking about them, obviously. They're like what they like to call those do-it-yourselfer kind of websites, because you go into your local auto parts store, you try to tell them, hey, I need a headlamp for my car. They go in the back, they give you a random box. You don't know if it's the right one, the make, the model. And not only that, they're going to charge you, what, 30, 50, even 100 times more for that particular part. I've asked Doug numerous times. He's gotten this down to a science. Doug, how many car parts are there?
Oh, Evan Demerol from the Locked On Cavs told us this the other day, and 2,000?
I think that's low. It might have been 9,000, could have been 4. The bottom line is we're not entirely sure. Not a big stat guy unless it supports our claim. And the one stat that we'll keep telling you about Rock Auto is that they're going to save you money. You get over to their website where they have been a family-run business. You can use their easy-to-navigate drop-down menu. Again, find your car, find the make and model, get the part that you want, and know that you're getting it at a great price. And by the way, when you go over to rockauto.com right now and you see all those parts that are available for your car or truck, you can write Locked On in their How Did You Hear About Us box so they know that we sent you. It's amazing selection, reliably low prices, and all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. So my one follow-up here is that if you up Kyrie Irving, and that's cool.
Like you're saying, if you re-up him on a max contract.
Yes, you go max contract with this guy. But now once you've done that, like that is also it. Like it's over at that point, because you just said, well, now you're on this number. And, you know, if you wanted to trade him, you can't trade him. Like if you can't go to Kevin Durant now and have the discussion around what it means to have Kyrie Irving on this team, the possibilities of winning a championship and going forward, if you can't have that conversation with him now, how are you having it in another year or 2 years and saying, hey, now 2 years later, it's still not working out. We'd like to trade Kyrie Irving for pennies on the dollar. Kevin Durant is still going to then tell you at that point, but he's my boy. Like, we can get this done. It's just what we need to accomplish here. And I want your feedback before we get into Katie's comments.
Yeah, and the difference between those two, and I'll say the difference between these two contracts and the situations, right? Like, so I don't think that the Nets are never planning on trading Kevin Durant. Okay, I don't think that's that's not in their plans, and I'm not suggesting they are. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that at some point, Kyrie and KD were getting fed up with the Nets. It was all a mess. It's two more years of being bad, of first round exits, whatever the thing is. And they just both decide. Mm-hmm. There's almost no world where Kevin Durant doesn't have like still pretty nice value at the end of this contract. He's still Kevin Durant. I think people don't question like the professionalism. There's no question around the talent, even a declining skill set. Like you still have a 7-footer that can hit everything in the mid range. Like there's lots of ways that contract, if he were to ask out, at the end, like there's lots of ways where the Nets can maybe think about starting a rebuild, right? Okay. Yeah. I know this is like super doom and gloom, but it's worth it to play out these scenarios just to think about like organizationally kind of stuff you have to think about, right? Yep. You might not talk about it. Maybe in your quieter moments you think about it, but like it would be smart to not. You have to think about all the stuff that just happens in the NBA. Guys just ask out more than not, right? So it's like, okay, so that's one thing. But if it went bad in this, let's say it went bad in this over this scenario, and Kyrie had the same thing, like even if they did it in tandem, I don't know, like Kyrie's trade value now is the weirdest thing to even evaluate, right? Yeah. like I don't think a lot of teams would want to bring it in. Now you say, well, that's what everyone thought about Ben Simmons. The Nets just traded for him. Okay, fine. There is an example out there, and I'm sure that something can happen, but sometimes not. Like John Wall can't be traded. Russell Westbrook's not going to be able to be traded. Like you can just hit a point where you make too much money and you're kind of a mini headache or whatever, and that's it. Like you're just not going anywhere, right? So I think that I'd have to look at those two situations as being different. Like if the bottom really fell out of this thing, I think Kyrie's just a net for life. If you sign him on a 5-year contract, but come hook or by crook. And it's scary. I'll say from an organization and wanting to win championships, one thing, if I was the Nets, I'd be thinking about, and this goes back to your original point around Kyrie, is that, wanting to see some kind of commitment around, and you use the player option as a sign of that, right? Or, they've talked about like pay for play stuff. That's not going to get through the CBA this time. So I don't think that's the case, but, saying, hey, we'll do 2 years, mm-hmm. And because you can say like, hey, dude, you played 20 games the first year, 54 in the second year, 39 in the third year. You've played, 111 or 113 games, or 103 games over 3 seasons. each one of those things can be explained, but the number is still the number, right? Like the
And
number.
yet, I still only see. And by the way, like as opposed to, because if you say how many games has Kevin Durant played, but that gets obviously horribly skewed based on he came in the first year completely injured. You weren't going to have him.
And
Period. Right.
him not playing was only ever injury. That was not the Kyrie case.
100%.
Like Kevin Durant's not playing was only 1-to-1 injury related. Kyrie's situation is not 1-to-1 injury related. Kyrie has other context around why he's not playing. A lot of it is injury. Like the 20-game first season was injury, but there was questions around the injury even at the time and what was being done around the shoulder. Like now that some of that's on the Nets because they're terrible with this stuff. But that was not that. Year 2 was some injury and was when he just took a leave of absence from the team for reasons that are still not totally clear. So that was not injury related. And so, and then we have year 3, which for whatever thing, it's not injury related. So it's just something else. It was
Still a thing.
It's mandates and rules and other stuff. And wherever you land on it, he just still didn't play and it wasn't injury related. So
and by the way, too, because I want to touch on the player option again here in a second, but regardless, you said it yesterday. Choice, mandate, it's all over. It's all in the past. We don't have to go back into it. But short of saying, there were a lot of players that may or may not have wanted to partake in that, but they made decisions based on organizational expectations, teammates, whatever it was. It's not a judgment. It's just a fact. And that's something that I think, whether it's this thing this year or a shoulder or a birthday or something occurring in and around the world, that impacts the way Kyrie Irving looks at things. And that's why just inside of this little bubble here of that player option piece, I do think that if we take away the impact on Kevin Durant, I know it's a stupid premise to put up there, but just to your point of, if you re-up him on something and he isn't going to be a tradable contract potentially, and it's going to be looking like a John Wall scenario, like that is what you get here. He walks off into the sunset and goes somewhere else because he hops out. You immediately have that money in your hands to go spend to build this team. And if there's one element of the risk reward of Kevin Durant saying, I would prefer him to be here, or if he's flat out said, you move him, I'm done, or you don't re-up him, I'm done. Any other version but a max contract for Kyrie, I'm done. If he stops anywhere short of that, then I think if you're Sean Marks, you go, just give me, watch what I do, so that by the time we get to this season, you go, listen, if you don't want to be here when we get to game number 1 of the upcoming NBA season, I will trade you ahead of the deadline, because I'm so confident that with this money and the things that I can do, I'm going to surround you with a talented team that's going to make you go, listen, I do love Kyrie. I also love winning, and I love my NBA basketball legacy, and I can see how I can win more with this new look.
Yeah, like these are such tricky conversations to have with superstars, right? And I always wonder, look,
Yeah.
we're never behind closed doors. We get reports about what things are, and then we kind of put conjecture, we have some conjecture around how we think, and then we add our own little life into it around how we talk to our friends and family, and that's just not how it works with these guys, and that's almost always wrong. Like comparing yourself to a superstar basketball player who everyone in the world knows, who makes $50 million a year,
Sure.
like you cannot put yourself in that person's place. It's totally impossible. Like it just, and this is why, by the way, this is why going back to these people that go after people on Twitter, it's like, what do you think you're doing to them? Like, it just doesn't, like, they're not you. Like, these aren't your friends. That might be annoying to your friends or your ex-girlfriend or something, but like, it's not going to affect these guys in any way. I think that's a rational conversation that you could have with your buddy. I just think you can't really have it with Kevin Durant, because my guess is you already know what the answer is going to be. Right? Like,
I'm sure Sean Marks doesn't approach it if he already has a pretty clear, path around it. And maybe he does. And maybe that's what you're saying. It's like he already knows what the answer would be. But you can only ask it if you think at the worst he'll say, no, I get it. It's been a rough couple of years here, but we can do this. Then you go, all right, I hear you, KD, right? Like if you feel comfortable enough just to throw it out there in the wind, then you're good. If you feel like you're 50-50 on Kevin Durant going, let me go ahead and scrub my social media of all things Brooklyn Nets, I'll see you never, then you obviously don't bother.
All right, I got a longer answer for this one as well. We are out of time for part 1 of our long-ranging discussion around Kyrie Irving and what the Nets should do this offseason. Make sure you like and subscribing over on YouTube. sorry, I got a little confused because I'm ready to keep talking about this. Like and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, as well on YouTube. We're just no quotes at the end of this one. We're just going to roll out with the theme music. We'll be back again tomorrow talking part 2 of what the Nets should do about the Kyrie Irving off season.
Whoa.